Your player might be way better than you think they are in MFL, but you're not playing them in the right position. In today's video, we're going to go through why position is so important in MFL and why the ratings of players can change drastically depending on the position you put them in. With so many new users in the last few months playing MFL, there's a few elements of the white paper that haven't quite got through to the full community. And so in today's video, I'm going to address one of the questions that me and other community members get asked all the time, which is about playing players out of position. Before we fully get into player positions and why they're important, Season 7 is about to start on MFL, and if you've not yet bought a club, there is a promo right now where you can buy a new Flint club and a starter pack for the same price as just buying a Flint club. That's $80 from MFL. If you don't want to do that, clubs are super cheap on the marketplace because we're in that mid-season. They've been going down as low as like $59 right now for a Spark club, so you can really get a hold of a club for super, super cheap. Follow my free-to-play team videos because that'll show you how you can then play for completely free. You don't need to buy any players. You can just loan them in. Get a feel for the game. If you don't want to use that, use the code that's on screen now when you sign up. We'll both get a free player when you sign up. And as a sneak peek of what I hope is going to be a video in a few weeks' time, one of my cards that I got from one of you beautiful people signing up and spending $25 was Agostinho Varela. And I didn't play him in Season 5. I did play him in Season 6, but only for the last week. And he went up plus 13. So these cards may seem low for you, but there is a chance you get a player like this who is going to grow into an absolute monster. Anyway, let's get back to player positions and why they're important. And we'll start with the white paper because that's where everybody should start. And this is just in terms of player generation. The position of a player is actually generated at random. Players have a primary position, which is the first one listed on the profile, or the one that's on the card. And then players can have up to 2 secondary positions, and these are really important. We'll get to why later on. So MFL have this in the white paper, but I don't like the way it's put out. The order of the attributes isn't the same as it is on the cards or when you're looking in the marketplace. So I've redone it myself and reordered them all so that it's pace, shooting, passing, dribbling, defending, and physical. And this is essentially the formula that gives you the overall rating of a player. You can take all of their 6 individual stats, plug them into these percentages, add all of those figures together, and you'll get the rating of the player. And as you can see, this calculation varies wildly. For a striker, for example, 46% of their overall is made up of their shooting stat. And if you've been looking at strikers in MFL, you'll have seen this. Players that have super high shooting tend to have really low stats elsewhere, be that pace or passing. But players who have kind of lower shooting or shooting that's around the rating of the card tend to have decent stats elsewhere because it kind of all needs to be about the same level. You then have like the next row back of players. So it's centre forwards, left wing and right wing. Passing becomes more important here. Dribbling is the most important stat. And physical drops out entirely. Then you've got cams on their own, where dribbling and passing are kind of equally as important. Shooting is still important. Pace becomes a little less important. And then you have what I think is probably the most controversial line, which is the left mid, centre mid, right mid combination. Mainly because pace isn't taken into account at all. For centre mids, I can understand this. For left and right mids, it's so important. So the fact that it doesn't affect their overall rating can mean that 2 players with exactly the same rating could perform so differently in game because they could have exactly the same stats in all 5 other stats, but their pace stat could be 40 ratings apart and they would still be given the same rating. I also think, especially in last year's engine, defending is quite an important stat for a left and right mid, especially if you're playing a 3-back formation. But just something to look out for when you're looking in that midfield area, because this is one of the wilder combination of percentages. At CDM, shooting drops out entirely. Defending becomes the most important stat with passing as a second. For wingbacks and fullbacks, they are rated the same, regardless if they're a wingback or fullback. Pace becomes important again. Their defending is obviously the most important, but with them kind of getting a little bit more involved in build-up and carrying the ball, passing and dribbling still have a decent percentage of their overall. And then at centre-back, very small on pace, very small in passing and dribbling, mainly focused on defending and physical. Again, what I was saying earlier with strikers that have super high shooting and low elsewhere. Defenders are exactly the same. They can have super high defending but be low elsewhere. But because players are rated differently depending on the position that they're being played in, some players can have absolutely huge overall boosts when played in a secondary position. When you play a player in a secondary or their third position, they only lose one from each of their attributes. And so let's say a player's first position is centre forward and they've got a really high shooting stat. You actually get double the boost for that shooting stat if they're then being played at striker. So if it's a centre forward striker, they may be way higher rated at striker than they are at centre forward. The same can happen with players that have like left mid and right mid and then striker. If they've got super high shooting, it's 4 times more important at striker. So you can get these massive rating differences, even though they're losing a stat essentially. So when you play a player in their secondary position, you take 1 stat off each of those 6 in-game stats. But you can also have 3 other kind of ratings of playing in position. So most players will have a fairly familiar position. So this isn't listed on their card, but it's usually the position that's closest to their primary position. You can see on this graph here, the kind of fairly familiar positions are the ones in yellow. For a right back, that would then be right wing back. For a left back, that would be left wing back. For a right wing back, it'd be right back, kind of vice versa. For the midfield, again, it's pretty much everything around their position. So a CDM is fairly familiar at centre mid. A centre mid is fairly familiar in both cam and DM, and a cam is fairly familiar in centre mid and centre forward. In the wing positions, it's very similar to left wing back and left back, where if you're a right mid, you're fairly familiar at right wing and kind of the same way around. And at striker, it's centre forward, and for centre forwards, it's cams and strikers. So it makes sense. It tends to be the position that you're closest to. Centre backs have no fairly familiar position and are the only outfield position that has this. So they would need to have a secondary position to not avoid fairly major drop-offs in their attributes. If you play a player in a fairly familiar position, you essentially take 5 off of their stats. So 5 off every single stat and then recalculate their overall. So even when it's taking 5 off, you can still have players being played in a position that's not on their card, that isn't a secondary position, and still be the position that they are the highest rated in. This tends to happen most around players with a super high shooting stat, a super high passing stat, or a super high defending stat, as they are the positions where they have the most sway. So if you can play a player that's centre forward at striker, obviously shooting is doubly as important. So if they've got a really high shooting stat, it can override that -5 in the attributes. Once we've gone through all of the penalties, I'll go through a few examples using a kind of table I've created so that we can see what the rating of each player would be in the different positions. The second worst familiarity is somewhat familiar. So this is kind of every position around where that player plays. So for a centre-back, it's the fullbacks and the CDM. For fullbacks, it's centre-back and right mid. So again, it's all pretty logical. In a somewhat familiar position, you can take 8 off every stat. It's less likely that a player in a somewhat familiar position will be the highest rated there. But again, it's worth thinking about. If you can play a player in a position, take 8 off their stats, and they're still really quite good, maybe it's worth playing that CDM with super high defending in at centre-back, because they may still have good enough stats or even better stats than players you already have there. And the final one is unfamiliar. So this is where a player's like nowhere near the positions they have on their card. And in these positions, you lose 20 from every stat. It is really unlikely you're ever going to get a player that's higher rated here. It can happen. If you have like a CDM with super high shooting, it can happen that actually at striker, they're probably pretty well rated, because even, let's say they're kind of 49 rated and have 85 shooting. If you played them at striker, they'd still have 65 shooting. And because it counts for half of the overall rating at striker, they may actually be a pretty good rated striker. So yeah, you wouldn't really want to play players out of position, but that's the penalty if you do. And here's what that looks like on a player's page. So you can see this is Marcus Sorare. He has 3 positions: left back, centre back, and left mid. So they're in this kind of light green. He'll only get -1 from his stats in each of those positions. He can play left wing back as a fairly familiar position and right back as a somewhat familiar position. This is because left back is his primary position. So they're the two, if you look on the graph, that's what left wing back and right back are. And because he has centre-back already and left mid on his card as secondary positions, they're bumped up to that just -1 secondary position status. And you can see his stats are pretty evenly spread here. Like, everything's above 50. His rating's only 54. And so I've put his stats in here into this kind of tracker. So this is a way to kind of see what his stats would look like when you played him in those different positions. So if I play him at centre-back, these are what his stats look like, or at left mid. If I play him at left wing back, that's what his stats will look like in game. If I play him at right back, that's what his stats look like. And if I play him at striker, that's what he's going to look like. So I'm probably not going to play him at striker. However, he has 57 shooting. And if you look at my kind of calculation table down here, if he did have striker position as a secondary position on his card, it would actually be his highest rated position. But because he's unfamiliar, these top 3 would need to have 20 taken off to see what his rating would be in game. So he'd be a 36 rated striker, a 35 rated centre forward, left wing or right wing, or a 34 rated cam. At left mid and centre back, he would only lose 1 of his overall rating. If you take 1 off every stat, you can just take it off the calculation that's made. You don't need to do any more calculations. It does just work that if you take 1 off every stat, it takes 1 off the overall rating. So at left mid, he would be 52 rated. Obviously, at centre mid and right mid, he doesn't have those positions, so he'd be 33 rated. CDM again, he doesn't have, so he'd be 33 rated. At left back, we know that he's 54. That's his primary position. That's the rating on the card. At right back, because he's only somewhat familiar, he would be 46 rated. And at left wing back, because he is fairly familiar, he'd be 49 rated. So he could kind of do a job there. And then we've got centre back. Because his defending stat is quite high, he has a good rating at centre back. He would be 53 rated if I played in there. Remember, you lose 1 for playing in your secondary position. So you can see how I actually have lots of opportunity here to play Marcus Saraiva wherever I want. He could play left back. That's his strongest position. He could play left mid. It's not too much of a drop-off. He can play centre-back. It's not too much of a drop-off. So he's quite a dynamic player. But then I have a player like Jack Butler. So he's a right-back as his primary position. He has centre-back and right wing-back as his alternative positions. So therefore, he's somewhat familiar at right mid and left back. As you can see on his card, he has a super high defending stat. So he's a 74 rated right back, but if I put his stats into this spreadsheet, you can see that at centre back, he would be 77 rated if it was his primary position, but as he loses 1 for it being his secondary position, he would be a 76 rated centre back. So he's actually better playing centre back than he is in his primary position. Now, you can be sad like me and build your own spreadsheet to look at this kind of stuff. Or you can go to MFL Player Info, where you can just put in either the ID of your player or the name of your player, and you can see their stats, but also exactly what rating they are in each different position. So this will show you everything, both their somewhat familiar, fairly familiar, and their completely unknown positions. And if I take this to the absolute extreme, this is one of the biggest differences I've seen. This is Mauricio Robles, who is a left mid on his card, but has 81 shooting. He has striker as a secondary position, and at striker, he goes from 56 rated to 72 rated. So you can kind of set your team up with what looks like a really low average rating, but actually in game plays way, way above that rating because you're playing players in their secondary positions. If you think about how the cups are decided, you are put into cups based on the rating of your first 11. So if you built a team full of these kinds of players, you can actually kind of game the cups a little bit and make sure that you win them because your team would be way higher rated actually in game than everyone you were playing. It's difficult to do that. People tend to know that they've got players that have kind of super high stats, and so they price them more akin to what their upgraded rating is, rather than what their rating would be at their primary position. So yeah, I hope that's answered anybody's questions that they have about position. You can play players comfortably out of position. They will still perform well, but go and use sites like MFL Player Info. All the other websites, I think, also show this data, but MFL Player Info is the easiest way to see it quickly. It shows you down here. Stats are super important in MFL, more important than overall. There are a few stat distributions I would never touch, even if they give you a high overall. So make sure to check your players, see what they're good at, see if they have a secondary position that they might actually be better in. especially that kind of wide mid to striker. That tends to be the one that gives the biggest boost. And I've seen some confusion in the community where they've thought that the secondary position you then need to take the rating off of. So, for example, Robles here, it says he's 62 rated at left wing. I've seen people then say, oh, but I then need to take 5 off because it's only a fairly familiar position, so he's actually 57 rated. That's not true. The 62 rating is calculated with those 5 stats taken off each of those attributes. So that's the way to think about it. If you're playing a player out of position, take it off the attributes. The overall is kind of then done from those reduced attributes. If you have any more questions about position, please leave them in the comments. I and other members of the community will absolutely be happy to answer them. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've been JoshXLS. I'll catch you in the next one.